Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this A-level religious studies video. I'm Wardle, and today we are comparing religious and non-religious understandings of the conscience. We will also be evaluating the value of conscience as a moral guide. So plenty to talk about today. I think the key question that we'll be considering is this question of whether conscience is the infallible voice of God within us, or whether it is the internalized voice of society within us. So, for example, St. Augustine believed that the conscience is the infallible voice of God within us. And so, of course, for him, the conscience is very important as a moral guide. He would say we are obliged to follow it because it has divine authority. Whereas for someone like Freud, he believed that the conscience is actually the internalized voices of authority figures from our childhood. So from our parents and our grandparents, when they were telling us off or telling us what to do when we were little. And he says we then actually carry those voices with us throughout our lives. And when we do something that our parents or grandparents wouldn't have approved of, we actually feel guilt even as adults. So when you don't finish your plate of food at a restaurant, for example, you might feel guilty because your granny once told you that you need to eat all of your vegetables. Don't you know there are children starving in the world? So it's really interesting to consider, where does the conscience actually come from? And then what authority does it have for human beings today? So as I say, we're going to compare those different religious and non-religious ideas about conscience, and we're going to evaluate them as well, so that we can make a judgment about the value and importance of conscience as a guide for moral decision making. So let's get started, shall we, by asking what I think is quite an important question, which is, what actually is the role of the conscience? So what does it do? What purpose does it have? What function does it fulfill? I think it's also interesting to consider, what do you think the conscience is? You know, when you hear that word, what image, what ideas actually come to mind? Is it of some little voice box in your head telling you what to do? Is it the angel and devil on your shoulders? Or have you got a different understanding of conscience? You know, please do let me know in the comments what does come to mind when you think of conscience. But let's actually think about the role of it. Some people would say that the role of conscience is to help you decide what should be done before making a moral decision. It might also be there to inform moral agents whether their actions were right or wrong. So, for example, it may lead to a feeling of guilt after the event when you've done something that you then reflect upon and you think, actually, I shouldn't have done that. Or could it be that it demands a particular course of action? So, you know, what is the role of the conscience? Does it come into play before you've done something, whilst you're doing it? Or is it after you've done something? Or could it be all three of those? So let's just start to think at the start of today's video, what actually is the role of the conscience? What purpose does it have? What function does it fulfill? So we're going to start by looking at our religious understandings of the conscience. And for each one, I'm going to give you your AO1 key knowledge about this understanding, as well as your AO2 evaluation points. So we will be looking at the strengths and the criticisms of each understanding. And then after we've looked at the religious understandings, we're going to look at the non-religious understandings as well. And we will be looking at Freud, Fromm, and Kohlberg. So we will then be able to compare these religious and then the non-religious understandings. So you can make a judgment about what the conscience actually is and what role it has to play in moral decision making. So we will be starting with St. Augustine, who has probably the most traditional understanding of conscience, that it is the innate voice of God. And so he believes that it has divine authority and that we are obliged to follow it because it is literally God speaking to us. I always imagine this one as being a bit like God having a microphone and then you've got a little speaker in your head and he's telling you, do this, do not kill, don't do that. You know, it's very much about God speaking directly to you. St. Thomas Aquinas then has another religious understanding, and of course we know him from natural moral law, and we will be referring to natural moral law today because his understanding of conscience is that it is the God-given faculty of reason. So we'll be looking at his synderesis principle and the idea that God has given us this ability to think, reflect, and consider, and that he wants us to be responsible for our moral decisions, and we need to do good and avoid evil in our moral decision making. We will also be looking at Bishop Butler. You may not have met him yet on the course, but we will be meeting him today. And he believed conscience is a God-given reflective principle. So it is our ability to reflect on our actions. And he sees the conscience as our guide and our governor, which is governed by two things, by prudence and benevolence. And we'll talk about them more later. And then our fourth religious understanding will be Joseph Fletcher, who of course we know for his situation ethical theory. And his idea of conscience is very much grounded in situation ethics. We can't talk about his idea of conscience without talking about his situation ethics, because he did not see the conscience as a thing. He was very unique in his understanding, very different from Augustine, Aquinas and Butler, because he does not see the conscience as a thing, but he actually sees it as a verb. So it's not a noun, it's not a thing, but it's a verb. It is an action, it's a label. And he saw conscience as a process. It is our attempt to make a decision. And as I say, that fits in very well with his situation ethics and his idea of the agapeic calculus. So plenty to talk about. We're going to start with St. Augustine, who of course we're very familiar with because of his ideas on original sin and the influence that he's had on the Catholic Church. So his idea of the conscience, as I say, is your classic traditional Christian understanding, that your conscience is the innate voice of God within you. So, as I say, for St. Augustine, the conscience is literally the innate, and remember, innate means within, voice of God. And he believed it has been placed into the human mind by God, so it amounts to an innate knowledge of God's laws. So as I say, I always think of this as being a bit like God having a microphone and then speaking directly to you. He's put a little speaker in your mind, and then he's got a direct communication with you where he's telling you, do this, don't do that, behave yourself. So he therefore believes that our conscience informs us and it is infallible in what it tells us about what is right and wrong. So, of course, we need to listen to the voice of God within us. It should be our authoritative moral guide. So for St. Augustine, and this is a very simple, very straightforward understanding, the conscience is the innate voice of God within us. So what are the strengths of this understanding? What can we say is a real strength of his idea here? Well, we can say it is consistent with scripture, which of course is always important for Christians. We read in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, for example, that conscience is a witness to the requirements of the law. So we can see consistency between Augustine's idea here and what we read in scripture. We can also then say it is supported by later theologians. Schleiermacher, for example, writes that conscience is the voice of God within an original revelation from God. So again, he saw it as this voice of God within us that has authority and that provides us with instructions. So our strengths are very much grounded in that idea that it's consistent with scripture, but then there is also later support from theologians. So Augustine does have a bit of backing. However, we can, of course, criticize and critique his idea of conscience. So we can identify flaws in his thinking and problems with his theory. So the first one, of course, is that it depends on belief in God. If you don't believe that there is a God, you are not going to believe that conscience is the innate voice of God. So when we compare with Freud, Fromm and Kohlberg, for example, they would find this to be an absolutely ridiculous idea, that there is some kind of innate voice of God, that there's a little speaker in your head that is broadcasting God's laws to you and providing you with a commentary on everything that you're doing. We could also say that the amount of moral evil in the world seems to suggest that not everybody hears the voice of God within them. So, have some people's speakers run out of batteries? Because it seems to be that if God was speaking to everybody, why are people doing moral evil? Why is there so much moral evil in the world? Is God selective, for example, in who he speaks to, or are people ignoring him? Are we actually saying that all these people doing moral evil, they did have the innate voice of God within them and they chose to ignore it? Surely then, God needs to turn up the volume. He needs to start shouting down that microphone a little bit louder. If we build on that, we could say that different people have different ideas of the good, don't they? And that's quite a nice link to meta-ethics as well. So that seems to suggest that God says different things to different people. If God was actually broadcasting the same message to everybody, then surely when we all get together and debate moral issues, we would all agree. But of course, we know, don't we? People don't all agree on moral issues. So does that suggest that God is giving different people different messages? Because the idea that there is an innate voice suggests there should be consistency and uniformity in our moral thinking and in our moral decision making. But the fact that there isn't seems to undermine the idea that there is this one innate voice that everybody is hearing. People seem to be tuned into different frequencies, don't they? They seem to be hearing different messages. And then a really interesting one is, does this not compromise free will? We know that Augustine prioritizes free will. One of his most famous quotes is that for a runaway horse is better than a stone. But actually, could we argue that if conscience is the voice of God speaking to us, can we actually be called morally free? Now, of course, you could argue, well, yes, because you then choose to follow that voice. But you could still argue, I think, does this not compromise that idea of free will, that we are autonomous decision makers? So lots to think about there in terms of St. Augustine's classic traditional idea of the conscience as the innate voice of God. We are going to look now at Aquinas's idea of the conscience, which has got a little bit more development and is very different in terms of Augustine said that conscience is the voice of God within us, whereas Aquinas says it is a God-given ability. So God isn't telling us what to do. He has given us the skills to decide for ourselves. He has given us the skills to think for ourselves. So he has given us the tools rather than the instructions, if that makes sense. And this very much, of course, as I said before, is, rooted in his idea of natural moral law. And of course, we're also going to link in Aristotle here, because reason and the importance of reason for human beings is something that Aquinas gets from Aristotle. We know Aristotle's hierarchy of souls is that idea that humans are at the top of the hierarchy because they have a rational soul. They have the ability to use reason and think for themselves. And Aquinas's idea of conscience is very much rooted in, as you can see, that God-given, as he sees it, ability to reason, to consider things, to reflect, and to make judgments. So, as I say, it's really important to remember whenever we're talking about Aquinas's view on conscience, that he developed natural moral law, and that his idea of conscience very much fits into that bigger picture of natural moral law. So make sure you refer to natural moral law in any essays you're writing that talk about Aquinas and his view on conscience. So he begins his starting point, and again, we know this from natural moral law, with what he calls the synderesis principle, the idea that good should be done and evil should be avoided. And he says that that governs all human reasoning. He wrote that synderesis is in the rational part of a human agent. It is a natural disposition of the human mind. Now, of course, we can evaluate whether all people do have this disposition to do good and avoid evil. But remember, that is Aquinas' starting point, that God has implanted within us the synderesis principle to do good and avoid evil. And then human reasoning is all about choosing and making that effort to pursue good, to do good and avoid evil in our moral decision making. So he argues that what is innate for humans is not the voice of God telling them what to do. So this is where he is different, where he differs from Augustine, but it's actually the God-given faculty of reason. So as I say, we don't have a little speaker in our head where God is broadcasting instructions to us. Instead, he's given us the ability to reason. He has given us the tools and the skills to make these decisions and make these judgments for ourselves. So we have to use practical reason. And again, you can see really heavy Aristotelian influence here. And we have to then make those decisions for ourselves. We make those judgments. And Aquinas says that if we use reason and we think of that synderesis principle, we seek to do good and avoid evil, we will arrive at and we will understand the 5 primary precepts of natural moral law. So they will be self-evident to us. But he says conscience then has an important role to play in applying them through the secondary precepts to particular situations. So for Aquinas, the conscience has a really important role to play because it is this God-given faculty of reason. God has given you the ability to think, reflect, and make judgments. So you need to use your conscience to make moral decisions, to understand the secondary precepts, and to follow them. Now, really importantly here, Aquinas believes that the conscience is therefore fallible and that it can be mistaken. And that is, of course, because it is not the innate voice of God speaking to you, giving you those direct divine commands. It is actually a gift that God has given you. It is a skill that God has given you. And so it is ultimately you doing the thinking and it is you making the decisions. So your conscience can make a wrong decision because human beings are fallible, human beings are flawed, and so we are going to make wrong decisions. So for example, and this is an example he gave, if we are not fully informed about the facts of the case, when we use our God-given faculty of reason to make a moral judgment, we might not make the right moral judgment because there has been ignorance in our decision making. But really importantly, Aquinas says that the conscience should still always be followed. So even though it is fallible, even though it can make mistakes, we should still follow it. And the reason is the conscience is the best moral guide that we've got. So even though it is not infallible, it is the best moral guide that we've got. And so he says what the conscience dictates is true to the individual concerned is therefore true to you. And so truth must be followed. So although the conscience is fallible, it should be followed because it is the God-given faculty of reason. So what do we think of this? Do we like this idea? Do we think this is better than Augustine's? Can we identify any flaws in Aquinas's thinking? Well, I've said that a strength of his understanding is that it's more realistic because it considers the conscience is not fallible. He takes into account that it's something that we use, that is very much human, and we do make mistakes. So he acknowledges that the conscience can sometimes be wrong. So of course that does then explain why we do see evil in the world, because people do make mistakes, because remember, they are fallible. We could also say that his emphasis on reason safeguards human free will, because remember, the conscience is not God giving you direct instructions. It is a God-given faculty of reason. It is a God-given ability, a gift to reason. And so we could say that then safeguards free will, because ultimately it is on you what decisions you then make. Reason allows us to make freely chosen moral decisions. And then importantly, we then have moral responsibility for those decisions as well. In terms of the criticisms, though, again, we can say, well, it depends on belief in God again, doesn't it? His ideas are grounded in theism. So if we make a synoptic link to religious language, we can say this works very well if you play by the rules of the Christian language game, but anybody outside that form of life is not going to find this to be a satisfactory understanding of conscience because it's totally dependent on belief in God and the idea there is a God who has given you this God-given faculty of reason. We could also say that Aquinas is wrong to assume we all act according to the synderesis principle. So remember, that is integral not only to natural moral law, but also to his understanding of the conscience. You could say, actually, when we look at the world around us, how many people are driven by the desire to do good and avoid evil? Can we just say that all the moral evil we see is the result of ignorance? We could say, actually, he could be misunderstanding human nature there. And then finally, we could refer to the fact that many people act irrationally. So remember, it's about the idea we have this God-given faculty of reason. But what about all those people that we don't actually see using reason or exercising reason? So what does that tell us? Surely that tells us God has picked and chosen who he's going to give this faculty of reason to. Why is it that that faculty of reason is much more developed in some people than others? So for example, when we look at Kohlberg, he sees the conscience as the highest stage of moral development that not everybody reaches. We all go through the pre-conventional and the conventional stages of moral development, but only some people reach the post-conventional. They develop their individualized conscience. Why is it that some people are much more reasonable than other people? Surely if God had given us this ability, this faculty of reason, we would all have it in the same quantity. Why is it some people are much better at reasoning than other people? So again, more criticisms to be thinking about and obviously to be writing about in your essay. We are going to move on now to the third religious understanding, which is actually quite similar, because Joseph Butler, who was a Christian bishop, believed that the conscience is a reflective principle placed within us by God as a guide and a governor. So again, for Butler, the conscience is something given to us by God. It is not his voice speaking to us. It is actually something given to us. Again, it's a bit of a tool that he has given us and he has equipped us with. This time, however, Butler doesn't use the word reason. He uses the word reflective, and he sees the conscience as a guide and a governor that, again, he says we need to follow. So, as I say, you might not have met Bishop Butler before, so let me introduce you to him. He was a theologian, philosopher, and a bishop. So again, he's part of that religious language game. And he believed that conscience is a reflective sense of right and wrong that is placed within us by God. And he sees it as a natural guide, and here's a really important phrase for you, as a proper governor. So again, it is our duty to follow it. We need to be following it. So again, when we are evaluating the importance of conscience as a moral guide later on, for our theologians, they do think conscience is an authoritative moral guide, because although it can be wrong, although it could be mistaken, as Aquinas acknowledges, it still originates from God. It has been given to us by God, therefore it has divine authority. We could also, no, not we could, Butler would also say, excuse me, that it allows us to reflect morally on what we have done in the past and what we are to do in the future. So again, for Aquinas, it's about using reason. For Butler, it's all about reflecting. It's that ability to step back and think, right, what am I about to do? Should I be doing that? And what have I done? Should I have done that? So obviously you can then learn from what's happened in the past. And of course, the point here is always going to be, again, linking in with Aristotle's hierarchy of souls, this is something uniquely human. We don't see your pet dog standing back and thinking, should I have done that? Although having said that, I have seen my dog look quite guilty when he's stolen food from the kitchen, but we won't get into animal psychology today. The point is, this ability to reflect and to reason is typically seen as unique to human beings. And so our question is, does that come from God? Is that a reflection of us being made imago Dei with this special role in creation? So for Butler, it is a reflective principle, and he sees that as God-given, and so it should have authority for you as a guide and a governor. Now, he believed that it is based on two governing principles of human behaviour: prudence and benevolence. Now, if you studied virtue ethics, you should be familiar with the virtue of prudence, which is all about cautiousness, and it's all about thinking about things. So in terms of what Butler believes, prudence is our love of self. So it is thinking about ourselves, and it's also then about benevolence. It's about thinking of others. So for Butler, the conscience is about balancing these two things. It's about balancing the need to think about yourself and prioritize yourself with thinking about other people and prioritizing other people. So it's about balancing those two governing principles of prudence and benevolence. And so in order to function morally, you need to think about yourself, you need to exercise prudence and that cautiousness that is about self-interest, alongside benevolence, which is where you're thinking about the needs of others and about your love for others. So what do we think then? No, let's not evaluate yet. Do excuse me, I'm getting too excited. Let's actually look at what Butler himself wrote whilst we think about whether we like his idea of conscience. So just a couple of key quotes from Butler. Always nice to drop in a little quote in your essay just to ensure the examiner is giving you those top marks. So he said that there is a principle of reflection in men. So that's a really great phrase if you just want to include a soundbite, as I call them, in your essay. I'm actually going to highlight that, and this is where the whole PowerPoint could all go wrong and it will all collapse into chaos, but I'm going to give it a go because that's a brilliant line. He calls it a principle of reflection, there we go, in men. So that's a great little quote you can drop into your essay. You can say, Butler describes the conscience as a principle of reflection, by which they distinguish between approve and disapprove their own actions. And of course, that is what reflection is all about, isn't it? It's about reflecting on your actions and, thinking, was that the right thing to do? Will that be the right thing to do? He says we are constituted, so we are required to reflect upon our own nature. So again, that reflects the fact that for Butler, the conscience is a reflective principle. He said this faculty, so the conscience, tends to restrain man from doing mischief to each other. So the conscience stops you causing harm and leads them to do good. And I think that is very, very similar to what Aquinas said, isn't it? And his synderesis principle, that it's about doing good and avoiding evil. He said it is by this faculty, natural to man, that he is the moral agent. So again, this is what makes you a moral agent, your ability to reflect on the things that you will do and the things that you have done. And I think a really important line here is that he says natural to man. This is something natural to us because it has been placed within us by God. He also says, and this is, I think, my favourite quote from him actually, it therefore belongs to our condition of being. It is our duty to walk in that path and follow this guide. So that shows you, doesn't it, the authority Butler gives to the conscience. He says it is our duty to be reflective, to use that reflective ability given to us by God, and we have a duty to follow this guide, which reflects the fact he sees it as our guide and governor. So let's have a look at our strengths and weaknesses, shall we? You could say a strength of this is that it makes us morally responsible for our actions, because again, we are not being told what to do. We have been given an ability to make that judgment for ourselves. We've been given the ability to reflect on what we will do and what we have done by balancing prudence and benevolence. So as I've put here, we have been gifted the ability to reflect on our actions by God. This reflects free will, of course, which is very important for Christians. And importantly, it means we can be held accountable for our actions. So we can link that in nicely with the free will and moral responsibility topic on the AQA ethics specification as well. The idea that we have the ability to reflect, and so we can then be held accountable. We also have criticisms, though, of course. We could say some people do not have a balance between prudence and benevolence. Some people are overly selfish and only consider themselves. So you could actually critique Butler by saying he's misunderstood human nature. And again, you could do the same for Aquinas. You could say he is, seeing too much good in people, really. He is assuming that people are all considerate of others. Whereas we could say, actually, the state of nature, our natural state as human beings, is actually quite selfish. Thomas Hobbes, for example, said our natural state is a war of all against all, that the life of man is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. So actually, are human beings naturally benevolent? Is that something that we instinctively are? Or do some people have a lot more selfishness than selflessness? So we want to be thinking about human nature. Is he right that people do seek that balance between prudence and benevolence? Or actually, could those scales be distorted? And then another point, we could say moral evil in the world suggests that not everybody has this inner reflective principle. So again, we can use the evidence around us. We can say every crime that we see is actually evidence against the God-given conscience. Because if we all had a conscience that informed us of good and evil, surely there would be a lot less evil in the world. Surely there would be a lot less crime, there would be a lot less harm being caused. So does that tell us that there is not a conscience, or that actually the conscience isn't working very well? And so does God need to take it back to the warehouse and, get some DIY work done on it? Because clearly it needs improving in order to be more effective. So there we go, a look at Butler's idea there. And that is then our three traditional, shall we say, Christian ideas of the conscience covered. We've started with Augustine, we've looked at Aquinas and his focus on reason, and then we've looked at Butler and the idea conscience is a reflective principle. We are now going to look at Fletcher's quite unique, shall we say, Christian understanding of the conscience. And he sees the conscience as a verb. So if you're also studying A-level English language, you will absolutely love this section of the video, because we're going to be talking about nouns and verbs. And when I did A-level English language, I think that was all I spent my time doing, reading articles and circling the modal verbs and the pronoun choices. But yes, it takes me back to A-level English days. So we digress, do excuse me, reminiscing here about my own A-level experiences. For Joseph Fletcher, he sees conscience as a verb. So he sees conscience in a very different way. He does not see it as a thing we've been given, but as a process that we complete, or as something that we do. So as I've put here, Fletcher does not see the conscience as a thing that we do, or no, he does see it as something we do, sorry. Do excuse me. Do ignore what I've just said there. Let me start that again. Fletcher does not see the conscience as a thing that we have, but as a process, as something that we do. And you have to always consider this in the context of his situation ethics. He rejects the traditional idea of the conscience as an inner faculty or thing in itself. So he says it is not a thing, it is not an innate inner faculty. So he would dismiss Augustine's idea, Aquinas's idea, and Butler's idea. He would not like those ideas. Instead, he said the conscience is merely a word, and I'm going to get the highlighter out again now. He said it's merely a word for our attempts, and that's an important word, to make decisions. So it is our attempt to make a decision. It is not a thing that we have. It is not a skill that we've been given. It is our attempt to make decisions. So in other words, it is a label. And he says that conscience is something that we do when we are deciding and calculating how love, of course, is best served in a situation. So remember, he said that love's decisions are made situationally. And that is at the core of situation ethics. And so he says conscience is the label that we give to our attempts to decide what is the most loving thing to do. So conscience is what we do when we're using the agapeic calculus, but it is not a thing in itself. And he said, this is very famous, what he said here actually, the traditional error lies in thinking about conscience as a noun instead of a verb. So he says that is the mistake, to think of it as a thing rather than as something we do. That is the mistake. And he said that mistake reflects the fixity and the establishment mindedness of all love ethics as contrasted to love ethics. So he said that when people see the conscience as something that is fixed and as something that we have, that reflects the fixity and what he called the establishment mindedness of all law ethics, of legalism, which of course he didn't like. He said, drop the legalist love of laws and follow only the law of love. So he said, this is another example of these law ethicists who are too fixed in their thinking, who are too rigid, who are too traditional in their thinking. He said, with love ethics, we don't say that you have a conscience. Conscience instead is merely a word for our attempts to make decisions creatively, constructively, and fittingly. So conscience is a verb. It is something that we do. It is a label that we give rather than a thing that we have. And remember, whenever you're talking about Fletcher's idea of the conscience, you want to link it back to situation ethics, to his criticism of law ethics and his pursuit of love ethics, and the idea that love's decisions are made situationally. So what do we think of this idea? As I say, it's quite out there, isn't it? It's quite radical when you compare it with those traditional Christian ideas of the conscience. So we could say a strength of this, and actually I really like this first one, is that it resolves the problem of the conscience not being a physical feature of the brain by explaining it as a thing we do rather than as something that we have. So I think a really great criticism of of Augustine, Aquinas, and Butler is that if you go for an MRI scan or you create a model of the brain, we don't have an area of the brain that we can label as conscience. We can't actually find it. And we could say Fletcher resolves that because he says that the conscience isn't a thing that we have in our brain, it is something that we do. So it's not a feature of the brain that God has implanted, but it's actually a label that we give to a mental process. And you could say that resolves the problem of conscience not being found as of yet as a physical feature of our brain. You would surely expect, if Augustine was correct, that when you go for an MRI scan, they're going to see a little microphone box in your brain and they're going to hear God booming down the microphone speakers. But of course, with Fletcher, he resolves the problem that conscience hasn't been found as a physical feature of our brains, because he says it's actually a thing that we do, it is a verb rather than something that we have. You could also say that a strength of this is that it fits within his situation ethics. He actually shows how the conscience functions as a verb, of course, in the development of his situation ethics. So you could say that his understanding does work, and he has shown it to work as part of his ethical framework, which we call situation ethics. And also, again, another really strong strength, in my opinion, is that it shows why different people do make different moral decisions. Remember, we use that criticism when we're talking about Augustine especially, but I think we can apply it to the other Christian thinkers as well. The fact that people do cause moral evil, they do make so many wrong choices. And we can say, well, Fletcher explains that, because remember, he is seeing the conscience as a label for our attempt to make decisions. So of course there are going to be people who make the wrong decisions, and of course people are going to make different moral decisions because they're making their moral decisions on a situational, case-by-case basis. Remember, love's decisions are made situationally, not prescriptively. So his understanding of the conscience does take into account and does account for the vastly different ways in which people make moral decisions and judgments. However, what criticisms have we got here? Well, we could say that, again, it depends on belief in God. Remember, one of his presuppositions, one of his 4 presuppositions of situation ethics is positivism, which is belief in a God of love. So again, this idea is still grounded in the Christian religion, although, of course, many critics would say that situation ethics is not very Christian. It also depends on using situation ethics. You know, we can't separate his understanding of the conscience from his ethical theory. So if you don't like situation ethics, the chances are you won't like his idea of conscience, because it is grounded in applying love. It is grounded in his ethical theory and his use of the agapeic calculus. And then finally, we could say it contradicts traditional Christian understandings of the conscience as a faculty or as something we've been given by God. So just think of how Augustine, Aquinas, or even Butler would be reacting to hearing about Fletcher's understanding of the conscience. You could say that it really does contradict those traditional Christian ideas. So that could be seen as a weakness of his understanding of the conscience, because many Christians do believe that it is a thing that we have. It is a noun that has been given to us by God. So I just wonder now, actually, after considering those 4 Christian ideas about the conscience, which one you do think is the most convincing? Which one do you think makes the most sense? Maybe have a go at ranking them from number 1, the one that you think is the most convincing, down to number 4, the one that you think has the most flawed. And again, would be great to hear what you think in the comments below. But for now, we are going to move on to our secular understandings of the conscience. So we are going to consider 3 different non-religious ideas about the conscience. We're going to look at Freud's idea that conscience is the internalized voice of authority figures that makes us feel guilt. We're going to look at Fromm's idea that conscience develops in a social context as both authoritarian and humanistic. And then finally, we're going to look at Kohlberg's idea of moral development, and that conscience is the highest level of moral development. And again, we will look at your AO1, your key understanding, your key bullet points for each of these, and then we will evaluate them. We'll look at the strengths and the criticisms of each before we again think about making a judgment as to which one is the most convincing, which provides the most successful explanation. But of course, the headline point here with these secular understandings is that they challenge that traditional Christian idea that the conscience comes from God, because these understandings all say that the conscience is the result of our upbringing, that it's the result of our society, and that it is, in the case of Kohlberg, the highest level of our moral development. So a really different understanding of the conscience to that is held by traditional Christians. So let's get started with Sigmund Freud, who is a very interesting character, to say the least. As I'm sure you will agree if you've studied him, especially if you're doing psychology, I'm sure you've got a lot you could say about Sigmund Freud and his ideas. The idea that we're going to focus on here is his idea of the conscience, which he believed is the internalized voice of authority figures from your childhood that we experience as a feeling of guilt. So just to put this into context, Freud had this idea of the brain. This was his model for the mind. that there are three key components: the superego, the ego, and the id. And when we're talking about the conscience, we are talking about the superego, because according to Freud, the conscience is an aspect of the operation of the superego. And what this means is that the rules and regulations given to us by authority figures when we are children, such as our parents, our teachers, and our grandparents, are internalized. And what that means is we're like sponges, really. We soak up their instructions, we take in the messages that they've given us, and we internalize the rules and expectations that they had of us. And so, as we then grow up, we take those rules, we take those instructions, and we take those expectations with us. So in our childhood, and we know this from research into child development, we are like sponges. We take in so much information, don't we? And that information, our environment, has a massive influence on us. It shapes us and it molds us into who we grow up to be. And so Freud is saying that in childhood, we internalize the instructions, the rules, and the expectations that are given to us by our authority figures. And by authority figures, we mean the people that raise you: your parents, your grandparents, your carers, your teachers, as you get that little bit older. And importantly, he says that when we don't follow them, we feel guilt. And that's not just when we're children, but it's all the way through our lives. So because those voices are internalized, they stay with us. And so when we do something that our authority figures from childhood would disapprove of, we feel guilt, even as an adult. So that is how our internalized voices from childhood then act as our conscience. And that is primarily through feelings of guilt. And as they say, the classic example I always think of is that as a child, you know, if your granny said to you, if you've not finished all your plate, you can't have pudding. You need to eat everything on your plate. You need to eat all the peas, finish all your vegetables, or you can't have any pudding. And they might have used the line, there are children without any food in the world. You need to eat all your food. And so let's fast forward to you being really full. You've gone out for dinner, you're really full, you've had a big burger, you've got chips, you've got, you know, loads left on your plate, and you're absolutely full, but you feel really guilty about not finishing the meal because you've got your granny's voice in your head saying you need to finish your plate. There are children without any food in the world, and you feel really guilty about not finishing your meal. And that is an example, Freud might say, of that internalized voice from your childhood giving you a feeling of guilt. And that for him is the conscience. So importantly, it is not the voice of God speaking directly to you via the microphone and the speaker. It is actually the internalized voice of authority figures from your childhood. So just to break this down a little bit more, conscience is the functional part of the superego, as I say. So it's the part that judges and threatens you with punishment. So it holds you to account, really, for your actions. And Freud says that the superego is the internalization of external parental authority. And that then carries with you. You carry that with you, and it gives you feelings of guilt throughout your life. So just like your parents did when you were a child, your superego, your conscience, then tells you off, judges you, and gives you orders as an adult all the way through your adult life. So what do we think of this understanding? Well, we could say that it gives us a really helpful understanding of the origins of guilt, because so many of us do feel guilt, don't we? And it shows us where that comes from, because it's caused by going against what our authority figures told us as children. So it gives us really clear insight into where feelings of guilt come from. We can say it also takes into account the social influences of our conscience. So it reflects that our conscience is very much shaped by our upbringing and our parents. And it would obviously provide an explanation for the conscience that doesn't depend on God. So it explains why we feel guilt, why we feel compelled to feel in certain ways, or act in certain ways, I should say, but it doesn't require God, because it shows that actually the voice is not from God. It is actually the internalized voice of your authority figures from childhood. However, there are, of course, many criticisms of this Freudian understanding. We could say it reduces the conscience to the wishes of your parents or authority figures from your childhood. It reduces the conscience to a need for conformity to rules. And you could say, is that really all your conscience is? Is this not quite pessimistic in terms of how Freud is understanding your conscience? And of course, you could also say it contradicts the idea that the conscience is from God, because it's giving a very different explanation. So just something to think about. Do you agree with Freud that the conscience is the internalized voice of authority figures? Of course, the implication of this is that your conscience as a moral guide is just going to be feelings of guilt when you don't do what your authority figures told you to do as a child. So, of course, your conscience as a moral guide in this sense is very different than if you believe the conscience is the voice of God speaking within you. So it's really interesting to consider what is the implication of this for how you see the conscience, and whether you think the conscience is helpful as a moral guide, or is it actually something that is holding you back, you know, especially if you've had a difficult, troubled, or traumatic childhood. Could that have a really negative implication? For example, when we apply conscience to telling lies or breaking promises, if as a child you were brought up in an environment where telling lies was the norm and breaking promises was the norm, does this mean that as an adult your conscience will not make you feel guilty about telling lies or breaking promises? So it shows us how our morality is actually shaped by our earliest formative experiences, and it comes primarily from our early caregivers and authority figures. So it's a very interesting insight into people's moral compasses and where they get their personal ethics from. But as I say, is this then helpful when thinking of the conscience as a moral guide? Anyway, we could spend hours talking about this, and we've got other things to cover. So let's keep going and look at Eric Fromm. So conscience for him develops in a social context as both authoritarian and humanistic. So what do these words mean? What did Fromm think? Well, really important with Fromm to consider the context in which he was thinking of these things, because he was a psychoanalyst, atheist philosopher, and a Marxist. And his ideas were very much developed in the context of the Holocaust and the horrors of World War II. So he was looking at what happened and he was thinking, why are all these people complicit? Why are so many people involved in the horrors of the Holocaust and the horrors of World War II in terms of what the Nazis were doing and what was happening, for example, in the concentration camps? And he realized that in many societies, especially in authoritarian societies, the key virtue is obedience. And obedience is the key driver in so many people's moral decision making and their ethical thinking. So, as I say, he believed that guilt, shame, the idea of conscience, and also moral responsibility in general all arise out of a fear of being rejected from society, because society is based on obedience to rules and conformity to norms. So, as I say, when he thinks about conscience, he sees it in this authoritarian sense as being about a fear of rejection from society, and so a focus on obedience, that people's decision making is driven by a need to obey and to conform to society. So he wrote a book called On Disobedience and Other Essays. And he said that in most social systems, the supreme virtue is obedience and the supreme sin is disobedience. And so he said, for most people, guilt is the result of feeling disobedient. They feel troubled because they know they have disobeyed a command, that they have gone against a social norm or a social expectation. And that is what he called an authoritarian conscience, when your sense of morality and your moral decision making is driven by a need to conform, to follow orders, and to obey social norms and authoritarian instruction. And this, importantly, is externally imposed. He said people do not think for themselves, but they are driven by a fear of disobeying orders. And this is how he made sense of what was going on, for example, with the Holocaust, that people were not actually thinking as autonomous moral agents, that they didn't have that ability in that context to think for themselves about what is right and wrong. Instead, the key driving force behind their conscience, if you like, which is developed socially and culturally, is fear. It's a fear of disobeying orders, and so it is a desire to obey. And obviously, this seems quite pessimistic, doesn't it? That we're just reducing our conscience to a fear of disobedience, and that all our moral decision making as agents, as moral agents, is driven by a fear of disobedience. But there is a bit of positivity in his theory, because he says we also have a humanistic conscience, which he said comes from within. So remember, for the authoritarian conscience, that is external, whereas we have also got this internal humanistic conscience. And he said that this humanistic conscience is driven by individual standards and not by a fear of external authority. So this is where we do have autonomy and where we can exercise individuality. And he wrote, this is the voice. So the humanistic conscience, which is within us, is the voice present in every human being, and it's independent from external sanctions and awards. So it's not driven by external reinforcement. He said we have an intuitive knowledge of what is human and inhuman, what is conducive to life and what is destructive of life. And that's why it's called the humanistic conscience, because it's driven by this understanding of what it means to be human, of what is conducive for life, so what will help life to flourish, and what is destructive of life, what will cause harm. And so he very much sees the conscience as this dualistic struggle, really, between the authoritarian conscience, which is external and is imposed on us by society, and that need for obedience, and then the humanistic conscience, which is within, which is driven by this impulse towards humanity that is focused on flourishing. And so for Fromm, both of these ideas of conscience have to be understood in a social context. The conscience, and this is the important bit for us, does not come from God. It is not a hotline to God. It is not God speaking to you. It is not a God-given ability to reason or a God-given ability to reflect. It is something that develops in a social context. And as he said himself, the conscience is like our capacities and speech and thought, and only develops in a social and cultural context. So he considered and he reflected on the fact that conscience is shaped in a social and cultural context. So very similar to Freud in that sense, but we could say he's much more positive and optimistic than Freud in his thinking. Because whilst Freud, of course, said that the conscience amounts to little more than following the orders of your childhood authority figures, for Fromm, at least he goes further and he says we do have the option or the ability to develop that humanistic conscience. So although they both consider the social influences, you could say Fromm's understanding is more optimistic. So let's evaluate that. So you could say that he again takes into account the social influences on human beings. So he does recognise that our conscience is formed in a social context. This is, of course, consistent with Freud's understanding of conscience as a source of guilt. You could say Fromm develops that by considering that that guilt is the result of disobedience to social norms and to authorities' orders. You could, though, say he's more optimistic than Freud because his conscience is not just the internalized voice of authority figures. You do have that ability to develop the humanistic conscience where you are thinking for yourself and you are driven by that human impulse. And again, another strength we could say is that it does not depend on belief in God. The humanistic conscience explains how the conscience does exist, but does not depend on theism to provide that explanation. So, of course, you know, more people might find it an idea they can get behind and that they can get on board with because, of course, it's not grounded in theism. It's not exclusive to that religious language game. However, a criticism, of course, is that this challenges traditional religious ideas about the conscience. For Aquinas, for Augustine, for Butler, they would say the conscience is God-given. It is not developed in a social context. It is not about obeying social orders. It's about, in Augustine's case, obeying God and his laws. So that leads us to our final understanding of the conscience, which I'm not going to be biased, but I do quite like this one. That's what I'm going to say. I'd like to hear your thoughts at the end of the video. So Lawrence Kohlberg, he saw the conscience as the highest level of moral development in a human being. And really importantly, he did not think everybody gets to this high level of moral development. He did not believe everybody develops an individualized conscience where they develop a set of their own ethical principles that they believe in. He said most people do not get beyond what he called the conventional stage of moral development, where they follow laws, where they follow rules, and they do things that they think will get them praise from other people. He said very few people actually rise to the top of the hierarchy and reach the highest level of moral development where they develop that individualized conscience, where they create their own universal ethical principles that they believe in and that they stand by. So let's have a look at what he means by this hierarchy, by this process of moral development. As you can see from this diagram here, he believes that everybody begins as a young child in the pre-conventional stage. And this is where your moral reasoning is very limited because, of course, you're only a little child. And it is based on reward and punishment. So we do things, we make decisions, if we can describe it in that way, when we're talking about a young child, because we want to avoid punishment. We don't want to be told off. So that is our driving factor. That is what shapes our moral decision making. We then, as we get to the age of 8 and through to 13, enter the conventional stage. This is where our moral reasoning is based on external ethics. So it's all about doing things that we will be praised for. So following the rules at school, doing good things in school because we'll be praised by teachers, we'll get a certificate, etc. And then also following rules. So most people, he says, do not get further than the conventional stage of moral development, which is where your moral reasoning is based on external ethics. And of course, you will see a similarity there with Fromm's authoritarian conscience. The idea that your moral decision making is all about external reinforcement. It's about what will authority figures say? What will society say? Am I going to break a rule and get into trouble? Or on the other hand, am I going to be praised for doing the right thing, for following expectations, for being a model student? And he says most people just get to conventional and that's it. Only a few select people actually climb into the post-conventional stage where they develop the individualized conscience because they develop their own set of universal ethical principles. And that is quite Kantian in terms of having a set of universalizable ethical principles. But he said very few people get there, where moral reasoning is based on personal ethics rather than on external ethics or simply on a desire for reward and an avoidance of punishment. So let's have a look at some of the key bullet points here. Just to tell you a bit of background information on Mr. Kohlberg, he was a 20th century American psychologist who was known for his work on moral development. And all that that means, and it's actually very interesting for us as ethics students, is he studied how people develop their morality, their ethical thinking. How does that actually develop in a human being? Are you born with the ability to make complex and really well thought out moral decisions? No, that is something over time. In the same way that we can track your biological development or your social development, he was interested in tracking your moral development. And he identified 6 stages of moral development in human beings. That begins at birth and then climbs through 6 stages. And he broke them down into 3 levels. They are pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And it is only the final stage, so in that post-conventional level, where you could, and the word is could because not everyone does, develop an individualized conscience. And that is where you develop your own ethics. So remember, not everybody develops a conscience. So this is obviously very different, isn't it, from those religious ideas, because for Augustine, Aquinas, and Butler, everybody has a conscience, whether that is the voice of God within them, whether that is a God-given ability to reason or reflect. For Kohlberg, this is something that only a select few actually develop. And the key word there is develop. It is not given to you, it is developed by you. So here are those 3 stages, and the one we need to focus on is that top one, the post-conventional level, the highest stage of moral development, which is the development of an individualized conscience. This is when an individual develops their own universal ethical principles and set of universal obligations. They think for themselves. And remember, it's not just now about obedience, it's not about reward, it's not about avoiding punishment, it's about thinking for yourself, and they develop their own set of universal obligations. They think for themselves and don't just think of themselves, they always think about the greatest good. So they would do something even if it would disadvantage them because they know that there is a greater good behind it. And importantly, to go against this conscience leads to guilt. so it will be followed, even if it leads to imprisonment or personal sacrifice. And as I say, very few reach this highest level because most people don't go beyond conventional, which is where their morality consists of adhering to social norms and following social rules. So really interesting that he's actually got some points in there that are very similar to other theories we've looked at. His point there about guilt, for example, we see that in Freud, don't we? We see that in Fromm. But also his point there where they think for themselves, I think is quite consistent with Aquinas. I think we can actually see some similarities here between what Aquinas would say in terms of a greatest good, pursuing synderesis, following those 5 primary precepts, which are universally binding. We can see in Kohlberg's thinking here some really interesting links and connections to other scholars, not only secular, but also religious. But yeah, just something to consider. Kohlberg's idea there of moral development. Conscience isn't something we are given. It is something that some people develop over their lives. So what are the strengths of his understanding? Well, we can say it takes into account how conscience develops and changes over time, which I think is interesting. Others haven't really taken that into account, have they? He is considering how your conscience develops. And for some people, they don't actually fully develop a conscience. And that would then explain, of course, why not everybody is a really moral saint. So it takes into account why there are crimes, because some people are just driven by reward and punishment. And obviously the punishment isn't a strong enough deterrent for them, so they commit the crime anyway. It emphasizes the importance of reasoning and moral reasoning. So again, can we see similarities there with Aquinas' ideas? It emphasizes autonomy of individuals and freedom of moral agents. But of course, he recognizes not everybody has that. He acknowledges not everybody has that autonomy and that freedom because they don't actually have a conscience. It is consistent with other sociological understandings that take into account the social influences on our conscience. And we could say another strength is that it's more optimistic than Freud as well, because we can go beyond guilt, we can go beyond obedience to those authoritarian voices from our childhoods. In terms of problems, though, we could say it challenges, again, the traditional religious ideas. So someone who believes conscience is the voice of God or that it is given by God would obviously challenge the idea that it's something we develop. And we could also say that it's quite culturally relative. His research may not apply to all people in all societies. So is this understanding applicable to all cultures? So we have now looked at our religious and our non-religious understandings of conscience. And I would be really interested to hear, actually, what do you think of them overall? Which do you think provides the best explanation for conscience and why? I would love to hear your judgments. Please let me know in the comments. But what we're going to do now is, not that that fits on the screen, we're going to do some applications. So we are going to be thinking here about applying conscience to telling lies and breaking promises. So this is a great way for us to consolidate our knowledge, and it's also a great way for us to develop some examples for the exam. So we're going to think about the different understandings of the conscience and what they would say about different moral issues. So application, as I say, to telling lies and breaking promises. What is our religious understanding? And we could say, well, for Augustine and his understanding, he saw the conscience as the voice of God speaking to you. Lying goes against God's commands and rules. Of course, the conscience would be against lying and you would be compelled to follow it as it is the infallible word of God. For Aquinas, remember, he had a slightly different understanding. It wasn't the voice of God, it was the God-given ability to reason. So you could say, well, using reasoning, and of course, using reasoning in accordance with the synderesis principle, which is to do good and avoid evil, you would ascertain that lying violates the primary precept of ordering of society. Therefore, Aquinas' conscience would reach the rational judgment that you should not tell lies or break promises. We could then, of course, talk about Fletcher, who has a radically different understanding of conscience. He said conscience is a verb rather than a noun. No action is always right or wrong, of course. That's the whole point of situation ethics. Love's decisions are made situationally. So he would, of course, say that conscience is just the label that we give to using the Agapeic calculus. So, you know, we would find that he would justify lying or breaking promises if it was the most loving thing to do. So, for example, lying to your partner to prevent heartbreak or devastation. That they've said, do I look good in my outfit? And you know it's too late for them to change. you're going to say, looks amazing, 10 out of 10, $1 million, have a good night, you know? You would say, well, go on, do the most loving thing. Use your agapeic calculus. In terms of your psychological and sociological understandings, Freud would say that if as a child your parents taught you not to lie, then of course the internalized voice of your parents would tell you lying is wrong. So of course you would feel guilt if you lied as an adult. In terms of what would Fromm say, well, his authoritarian conscience would say that it's wrong because it shows disloyalty to society, doesn't it? Because it would therefore lead to feelings of guilt and shame because virtue is the supreme obedience. No, obedience is the supreme virtue, excuse me. Sorry, guys. I clearly need some green tea. Obviously, if you're telling lies and breaking promises, that is not showing very much obedience to society. The humanistic conscience would also tell you it is wrong to cause harm to others. But of course, for a different reason. It wouldn't tell you that it's wrong because it is disloyal. It would be saying that it's wrong because it goes against that humanistic impulse. It's not conducive to flourishing to be lying and breaking promises. And then, of course, for Kohlberg, it depends on what level of moral development hierarchy you are at, doesn't it? So, of course, you might say that telling lies is wrong because you'd be told off. So at the conventional level, you'd say, well, it's wrong because I'd be told off if I was found out. But then at the post-conventional level, you've developed your own ethics. So you would be saying, well, yes, it is wrong because I believe lying is a universally harmful action. And so no one should lie. So just to break that down a little bit more, Augustine would say that the voice of God would be against telling lies if they go against the teachings of the Bible, which reveal divine laws. And remember, for him, the conscience is that little speaker that is announcing those laws to you. Aquinas said that the conscience would inform that telling lies or breaking promises is not rational because it conflicts with the Synderesis rule to do good and avoid evil. It breaks the primary precept of order in society. And of course, as we said, Fletcher would say, well, it's a label, it's not a thing. It's a verb. So decide the most loving thing in that situation. And then, as we said about our non-religious explanations, Freud would say it could lead to feelings of guilt, anxiety, and remorse because of what you were told as a child. But it's important to remember for Freud that conscience applied is not a moral issue. He's not seen this as a moral issue. It just gives you an insight into your upbringing and the values that you were instilled with as a child, which I think is a really interesting thing to remember. And then, of course, with our sociological understandings, we've got to think about the authoritarian conscience, as we have done, that it would prevent you from telling lies or breaking promises because of fear of society's disapproval, and that reflects social norms and structures and the supreme virtue that is obedience. And then Kohlberg, at the post-conventional level, we consider not just our needs, but the greater good of society. We cannot universalize telling lies or breaking promises, so we should not do this. Okay, let's have a look at a second application, shall we? Let's have a look at adultery. What do you think? I'm going to give this one over to you. So pause the video and have a go. Or if you've downloaded the PowerPoint, you can print this slide off and have a go at filling it in. What do you think about applications to adultery here? If you think about what would our religious understandings of the conscience say, what would our psychological and sociological understandings of the conscience say? Would they be happy with adultery or not? What do you think? So let's have a look, shall we? Well, let's start with our religious understandings. Augustine, the voice of God, would speak against adultery, of course, as it goes against divine law. The Ten Commandments say, do not commit adultery. Aquinas would say that reason dictates that adultery is wrong. It goes against the Synderesis principle to do good and avoid evil, and it breaks the precept for the ordering of society. So it leads to societal breakdown. And then Fletcher, adultery is not loving, it's not agapeic. So we could say, actually, this is one of the issues where, although he says love's decisions are made situationally, we can kind of guess what his conclusion is going to be. He says that it breaks up families and breaks down relationships. However, there could be circumstances when it is justifiable. For example, the couple are living in an unhappy marriage and they are both seeing their true love. So what if they're, both secretly homosexual, for example? So again, with Fletcher, it's all about in that situation. Remember, the conscience is a label for your attempt to make the right decision, to do the most loving thing. What about our psychological understanding? Freud, again, we'd be thinking of those feelings of guilt, anxiety, and remorse that would be surfacing. So remember, it's about the messages you received as a child and those teachings about being in a loving relationship and being committed to your partner. But of course, if that's not something you saw as a child, or that's not a message you were exposed to as a child, then actually you might not feel guilt about having an affair when you're older. Because if that was normal in your upbringing, could you think that that is normal, or at least not feel guilt as an adult? And then finally, sociological understanding. Adultery would be seen as socially destructive because, of course, as we mentioned before, the order and stability of society depends on truth and honesty. So for example, the authoritarian conscience would prevent you from committing adultery because of your fear of society's disapproval. For example, media coverage of those who commit adultery. The front pages are always quite critical, aren't they, when they have caught a footballer out, as it usually seems to be, having an affair. And Kohlberg as well, the conscience will prevent you from committing adultery because it cannot be universalized. So remember that highest level, that post-conventional level of moral development. You are thinking of the greater good, not just yourself and your lustful, sinful, evil desires. So there we go. All that is left to do now is to think about the value of the conscience as a moral guide. So this is where we bring everything we've looked at together and we consider what actually is the value of the conscience. What role does it have to play? Is it helpful? Is it useful? And of course, that's something you need to think about in terms of your AO2 evaluation for the exam. So let's do that. Let's start by asking about the value of conscience as the voice of God. So you could say that this type of conscience obviously would be valuable for a theist, for someone who does believe that it is the voice of God. They would see it as very valuable and as having absolute authority in their life. They would see it as infallible and they would believe it's their duty to follow it. However, if we actually think about it more deeply, this type of conscience may not be valuable if there is no way of knowing whether the voice you are hearing is God, or, of course, why different people seem to be getting different messages from God. So it does have value, you could say, for a theist, but actually, for somebody outside of that language game, outside of that form of life, they're going to have a lot of questions, and they're not going to believe that this is a useful way of understanding the conscience. If we think about the idea of conscience as internalized values, conscience would seem to unite society because its members have shared values, which the conscience enforces. However, the problem, and this is where we see the problems of the authoritarian conscience, if society's expectations or if what is going on in society is wrong and everybody is just obeying and everybody is seeing obedience as a virtue, we have a big problem, don't we? Because people are then all going to do the wrong thing morally. Surely they should be thinking for themselves. And that's where, of course, Fromm's humanistic conscience comes in. The next one, the value of Kohlberg's individualized conscience. So, of course, the top level of moral development, the highest post-conventional level. We could say this understanding of conscience would be valuable as it shows the conscience is uniquely human, giving a strongly rational account, of course. However, remember, not everybody is capable of it. So it's only useful for those people that have developed it. What about everybody else? What about the mere moral mortals? What do we do with them? What do they do? How about Aquinas's reason-based conscience? We could say this also shows it is uniquely human, as well as emphasizing that humans are autonomous, free agents. However, remember, he said it's not infallible, so it can't always be trusted. And again, it's based on belief in God. The value of feelings of guilt. So, of course, we're talking about Freud here. We could say that this understanding of the conscience shows that it acts as a warning and it can help to guide our conduct. So it can be helpful. However, we could say it can lead to feeling guilt about things we should not. I don't know if you've heard the phrase Catholic guilt before. The idea, you know, that many people who were brought up in a strict Catholic family can then feel guilt about really quite trivial things. And so you could say actually this can become a burden on somebody throughout their life. We could say the same about being gay. For example, if someone's brought up in a time period before homosexuality was legalized, and so as a child they received negative messages about homosexuality, that could then cause them a lot of guilt when being in a same-sex relationship themselves, for example, as an adult. And then finally, the value of conscience as a guide. What is the value of conscience as a guide? Well, I've concluded that conscience may be valuable as it guides us and helps us to reflect on our conduct. Bishop Butler would certainly agree. However, we could say the subjective nature of the conscience may undermine its value and caution against reliance. So it is on that note that I will end today's video by thanking you for joining me and asking you to please comment down below which of these ideas of conscience from Augustine, Aquinas, Butler, Fletcher, Freud, Fromm, and Kohlberg, which do you personally think is the best understanding of conscience? Which one do you think is the most useful? It would be great to hear from you. Please do comment them in the description, not in the description box below, in the comment box below, believe it or not. But yes, thank you for watching. I do hope this video has been helpful. Have a brilliant day and good luck with all of your studies. Bye-bye.